It started with a note taped to my front door, bold red letters from the HOA, asterisk. You have 24 hours to tear down your unauthorized structure. My jaw tightened as I read it. My cabin, the one I built with my own 2 hands on land that's been in my family for generations, was suddenly being labeled a violation. No warning, no conversation, just a deadline. I looked around the peaceful woods, the quiet lake just steps away, and couldn't believe this so-called homeowners association thought they had the right to erase it all overnight. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. I tried calling the HOA president, but all I got was voicemail. Then came the drive-by visits, 3 board members, clipboards in hand, glaring from the sidewalk like I was some criminal. One of them even snapped photos from her car. That's when I realized this wasn't about zoning or safety, it was about control. They didn't like that I wasn't part of their little circle. I didn't attend meetings, didn't trim my trees. To their standard, didn't decorate my mailbox like the rest of them. But what they didn't know was that I wasn't just sitting on a cabin. I also owned the land beneath half their fancy rental units. And while they were busy patting themselves on the back for flexing HOA power, I was already drafting new lease agreements. The kind that would shake their cozy little setup to the core. And I wasn't waiting for permission. I didn't always have issues with the HOA. When I first moved out here, it was just me, a stack of lumber, and a quiet patch of lakeside land that my grandfather left me. The cabin was never meant to be flashied, was just a place to breathe, away from the noise of city life. But over the years, new neighbors moved in. Cookie-cutter homes popped up around the lake, and with them came rules, lawn lengths, paint, colors, even noise restrictions after 7 p.m. Suddenly, this peaceful escape turned into a suburban power game run by a few people who thought they could control everyone. That's when I started noticing the same group of board members pressuring others too. One neighbor got fined for leaving his kayak on the dock. Another got written up for having a non-regulation mailbox. I'd kept quiet until they came for my cabin. That was my breaking point. What they didn't realize was that when my grandfather passed, he left me more than a slice of the lake. He left me a stake in the development behind most of their homes. A loophole in a contract meant I had rights they hadn't considered. I'd let them have their meetings and newsletter updates, but now they were stepping into territory I owned literally. While they were sleeping soundly that night, assuming I'd fold, I stayed up printing new lease adjustments. By morning, their lives were going to look very different, but I wasn't done yet. By the next morning, the HOA president, Aunt Nancy, was already pacing around the cul-de-sac, clipboard in hand, dressed like she was running for office. She had no idea the letters had already been delivered. The rent hikes weren't symbolic either. 300% increases across every property on land, tied to my grandfather's original deed. I'd found the clause buried in a dusty file box he retained. Silent ownership of several plots, including the clubhouse, tennis courts, and half the homes around the lake. It was a quiet arrangement he'd made decades ago when helping finance the development. Nobody had thought to check. When neighbors started getting the new lease notices, phones started ringing. Nancy stormed up to my cabin around noon, waving one of the letters like a flag of war. "This is a joke, right? You can't do this," she snapped. But she didn't know I'd already spoken to a property lawyer. Everything was legit. The HOA had spent years intimidating people into following their petty rules. But now they were cornered by paperwork they never read. Some folks were confused, others were quietly cheering me on. Meanwhile, started getting messages from other residents asking for help understanding their own property lines. One guy even offered to buy me lunch if I could dig into his lease. The irony was, the people the HOA had stepped on the hardest were now looking to me for answers. But this wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about who really had control and what I planned to do next. That night, the neighborhood group chat exploded. Some were furious, some confused, and a surprising number quietly supported me. One resident, Mr. Jensen, an elderly veteran, who'd been fined for keeping a small American flag on his porch, messaged asterisk, "It's about time someone stood up to them." But Nancy wasn't backing down. The next morning, she called an emergency HOA meeting, demanding every homeowner show up at the clubhouse. I walked in last, calm and collected, carrying a copy of the deed and legal documents I'd uncovered. Nancy stood at the front, fuming. "This man is threatening our entire community with baseless rent hikes," she shouted. The room buzzed. Tension thickened the air. I took my time. Then I held up the original contract signed decades ago by the land's original developers, including my grandfather. "You all signed leases on land you never actually owned," I said. "You want to talk about rules? Let's talk about sectos. Who really holds the keys?" Whispers turned to gasps. Even the board members looked stunned. The documents were stamped, dated, and verified. Nancy's face flushed red, but she didn't speak. I could see her grip tighten on the podium. Then came the twist. My lawyer had submitted a formal petition that morning to dissolve the current HOA structure and replace it with a resident-led committee. Something Nancy had fought against for years. All eyes were now on me. But I wasn't after power. Not really. What I wanted was for people to stop living in fear. And that part was just beginning. Just as the room settled into an uneasy silence, the back door opened and a man in a crisp suit walked in. He introduced himself as Jonathan Brooks, a private developer who claimed to have recently purchased several HOA-owned parcels quietly sold off during Nancy's leadership to cover maintenance debts no one had voted on. The crowd gasped. Again. Even I hadn't seen this coming. Jonathan pulled out plans blueprints for luxury condos and a parking lot right where our walking trails and the kids' playground sat. "We were told the HOA had unanimous board approval," he said flatly. "Construction starts next month." People stood up, shouting over one another. "We never approved this. What debts? This is our neighborhood." The room turned into chaos, and I watched Nancy slowly back away, her expression pale and unreadable. In the middle of the commotion, I got a text from my lawyer. Asterisk Brooks is real. But I've got something bigger. Call me ASAP. I stepped outside, heart pounding. That cabin they ordered me to tear down. Turns out it was the last legally recorded structure on the original tract of land, meaning it had historical protections. Not only did I own the land under several rental units, but any major development on that property now required my direct consent. The story was no longer just about rent hikes or tearing down a cabin. It was about uncovering how deep this HOA had gone in manipulating paperwork, exploiting residents, and nearly giving away everything under everyone's noses. And it wasn't over yet. The next morning, armed with the documents my lawyer had uncovered, I walked into the town hall meeting that the HOA had desperately tried to cancel. This time, I brought not just the paperwork, but a local reporter and a state historic preservation officer. As the crowd gathered, Nancy and the remaining board members sat nervously, clearly caught off guard. I laid everything out, the fraudulent land transfers, the backdoor deals with the developer, and most importantly, the historic protections tied to my cabin's original deed. That document made it illegal for any changes or developments to happen without my written consent. The room went dead silent. The reporter started snapping pictures. The preservation officer confirmed what I said, citing state law and landmark protection guidelines. Nancy tried to argue, but her voice cracked. Jonathan Brooks, the developer, suddenly looked less confident. especially when I informed him that I'd be pursuing legal action for trespassing and attempted unlawful development. Then I dropped the final twist: the increase in rent I'd issued to the HOA-owned properties. It had triggered a financial review. Turns out, their emergency funds were tied to those rental incomes when the 300% hike they were now in. Violation of their own bylaws. The board collapsed. Nancy resigned on the spot. And just as I thought it was over, the preservation officer pulled me aside and said, "You know, this cabin of yours might qualify for a state restoration grant." Suddenly, I wasn't just defending my land, I was about to rebuild it stronger than ever. After the dust settled, it felt strange walking around the lake again without having to look over my shoulder for HOA board members or angry notices on my door. The cabin, now officially listed as a protected historic property, stood stronger than ever, not just physically, but symbolically. My wife and I took a slow breath as the grant paperwork came through, allowing us to restore the place exactly how it deserved to be, honoring its past without being bullied into the future someone else wanted for it. The HOA's collapse triggered a full audit, and the rental income changes forced the community to rethink how they'd been operating. Surprisingly, some of the residents actually thanked me. Turns out, they'd been unhappy with the board's heavy-handed tactics for years, but never felt empowered to speak up. I guess all it takes is one person saying, "Enough,"